This podcast is made possible by supporters like you. Mahalo. And by Atlas Insurance Agency, Hawaii's largest professional agency, helping Hawaii navigate insurance solutions since 1929. More at atlasinsurance.com.
Aloha mai kākou. Welcome to a new episode of What School You Went? Start every conversation with that question. I'm Ron Mizutani, and today we're talking story with an impressive young man who understands his purpose. And like EF Hutton, when he talks, people listen. On April 4th, 2024, Sterling Higa, Executive Director of Housing Hawaii's Future, was one of several guests on Insights on PBS Hawaii, discussing state housing proposals. Our digital marketing coordinator, Chelsea Yee, posted a clip of Sterling Higa commenting on the cost to live on Maui that went absolutely viral. As of today, the clip has been watched on our YouTube page more than 7,055,000 times and counting. On our Instagram page, 2 posts garnered nearly 60,000 likes, 11,000 shares, prompted more than 2,600 comments. People are listening when he speaks. I'm so excited to welcome him to What School You Went and back to PBS Hawaii, obviously. Sterling, good to see you. Nice to meet you, young man.
Thank you for having me, Ron.
Hey, it's super cool. Before I continue, as I ask all of our guests, what school you went?
I went to Roosevelt.
You are a Rough Rider.
Rough Rider, just like Bruno Mars.
That's funny because Bruno speaks very proudly of his association with Roosevelt, and back when I was younger, Roosevelt, to this day, the alumni for Roosevelt, some of the biggest heavy hitters in town. And when they needed funds and such, whether it be the football field or just anything, they rally.
Yeah, great school. I'm a proud alumnus.
Yeah. Where did you grow up in the area?
I grew up right in Nu'uanu, so near Kawananakoa Middle School, kind of Nu'uanu School Street area, and spent pretty much my life until I was about 23 years old, all in the same area.
Nice. Like that's kind of set up who you are, is it? Is it not?
Yeah, I'm a townie. I think people say they're from town and they mean Kaimuki or Kalihi. But I grew up right in downtown Honolulu, and my mom worked downtown, so I spent a ton of time right in probably the most urban area in our state.
You know, I feel people ever, realize their purpose in life. For you, besides being a good father and a husband, you have spent much of your professional life, being helping young people and that vision of what tomorrow should and can look like. Where did that come from, Sterling?
I've been blessed with the opportunities I've had. I don't think that I chose this path in life. In a lot of ways, it was chosen for me. When I graduated from high school, I wanted to be a high school English teacher. And I stumbled into, in my first semester of undergraduate, slam poetry. And that really awakened for me the idea that I could use my voice and share a message. But I got involved with a program called You Speaks Hawaii that also was focused on teaching other people to use their voices. So we worked with high school students, teaching creative writing, performing arts, and trying to get them to tell their stories and see if they could make a difference in their communities. And so stumbling into that first writing workshop when I was 18 altered the whole course of my life. And everything since then has been growing in that desire to help other people tell their stories, to help other people address the issues that they face in their community.
Civic engagement.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, that's the part of it. But I want to go back to your years and exposure to slam poetry, because that's, to me, that's very fascinating. And our community in downtown is very active. And what got you excited about that? I mean, and what topic, if you will, did you focus your message on?
Well, I say that this path was chosen for me because I actually wasn't excited. My mom recommended that I go to one of these writing workshops, and it took me months to ever go. But she had seen something in me. She had recognized a desire in me to to write and to speak, and encouraged me to go down that path. And I can remember the date to the day, September 9th, 2009. That was the day I went to the first writing workshop because it altered the whole course of my life. The focus of my poetry a lot of times was on thinking about broader futures. So I wrote poems about homelessness in West Oahu. I wrote a poem about a mangrove seed that was a metaphor for the idea that ideas can be seeds that grow in people over time. And most of my writing was about this idea that we could grow and become better if we took time to kind of reflect on the past and where we've come from and had an idea of where we wanted to go as a community.
Interesting you talked about mangrove because while it is one of those, I won't say species, but one of the plants that can have deep roots, but it also can be invasive and it can be cumbersome and troublesome. Why the mangrove?
My initial impression of the mangrove was exactly that. It's this invasive species. And then as you see these seeds floating in the ocean, you think to yourself, how long has it been floating? And so I did research and realized that these seeds could float for months. Sometimes it seems years at a time. And so it's an invasive species that invaded on its own. It didn't need to be carried. These seeds were so resilient. And obviously, there's devastation associated with mangrove infestations. But as a plant, it is a metaphor for survival and resilience. Mm-hmm. It is a metaphor for what can sort of emerge from just a tiny, bean-shaped seed. Whole forests can grow out of a single seed. And that, for me, resonated in terms of the power of ideas. The power of stories can be the same way. As a student of a lot of really excellent mentors and teachers, I've had sort of their seeds planted, right, and that have grown through me, and that I hope to sort of propagate to other people as well.
Nice, very nice. Resiliency, right? And the mangrove is a perfect example of resiliency. That seed can still provide life, and I see that. I was wondering if that was the tie, and I can understand why you went there. University of Hawaii at Manoa alumnus, a master's degree in education from Harvard.
Yes, but don't leave out Honolulu Community College.
Absolutely.
When you get introduced and people say Harvard, right, automatically people start talking in more proper English and they look at me differently. But what I have to remind people is I started at Honolulu Community College. I applied to one school after high school because I wasn't the best high school student, and I knew that HCC would accept me. And oddly enough, of all the educational institutions I've attended, I think the quality of instruction that I received at HCC was among the best. I had an English professor there who I still keep in touch with to this day, Eric Paul Schaefer, who really honed my ability to craft sentences, to write clearly. And Eric Paul Schaefer has taught there for decades. And he pours into these students at community college. And some of the students I went to school with, I'm still friends with, still know. It's a different educational environment because it wasn't just students coming right out of high school. There were working parents there. There were people who had tons of responsibilities. And it was a really formative part of my educational career. In some ways, more so than Harvard. Harvard is a stamp on my resume. It looks good. It's nice to introduce with. But HCC is one of those places that really formed me.
Good for you. Well said. Absolutely well said. It's amazing what one professor can do and how it shapes your life, changes your life, and maybe even shapes the direction that you're headed. I was, not to get off of your subject, but you talked about being an English major, an English teacher, wanting to be. It was my English teacher at Kamehameha, Mrs. Hutchinson, who said, hey, you got some skills here. You might want to explore it. Never took her seriously. When I went to UH, Manoa, I was an accounting major, but I took my English 100 course, and it was that professor, his name escapes me because that was like years ago. He said, you need to be a journalist. You've got serious writing skills. I went to Kaleo, and the rest is history. I mean, it was that dude right there, an English 100. Otherwise, I would have been an accountant today. Go figure. So, yeah, I can understand how how somebody can open your world to a whole different world and maybe even your future. Your future is still being shaped. And But what you've accomplished in such a short time. Now, you still look like you're 18, but I know you're a father of 4, and you've accomplished so much professionally. Let's take us to that part of your life, being a dad and being a father. How special is that?
So I got married about 2.5 years ago. And my wife, we have 3 children from her previous marriage. So they're older. They're 10, 12, and 14. And we now have a baby girl who's 16 months old.
Nice.
So in the span of less than 3 years, I've gone from being a single man to being a married father of 4, which is a dramatic shift by any account. I don't wonder about purpose anymore. I don't wonder about what I should be doing on a day-to-day basis. If I ever have a free moment, there's something I can do, right? It's either helping my wife with laundry or cleaning the house, or it's helping the kids with school, or it's taking them to one of their hobbies, right? My youngest son, Isaac, does jujitsu. And this Saturday I have to take him to a jujitsu tournament, right? So I don't have any, I guess, the anxiety that I think a lot of young people have about what is life for, what am I doing here? It's a very profound responsibility to have a family. It's the most challenging thing I've ever done. It's the most rewarding thing I've ever done. I told friends that every cliche you hear about parenting is true, right?
Right.
Especially, when people talk about childbirth and they're like, the second you see that baby, your whole world will change. 100% true. And so I've gotten to have, on a very accelerated timeline, an insight into all of those cliches being true, which has been really fun.
The Surgeon General recently said that being a parent can be hazardous to your health. True story. But at the same time, being a parent has so many rewards.
Yes.
And you'll experience those rewards as you continue down parenthood with your wife. Congratulations on your baby as well. The Housing Hawaiʻi's Future, it's a nonprofit. And what was the goal behind that? It was more than just helping millennials and Generation Z. It's about creating opportunities. And where did that come from? Where did you say, hey, I can make a difference in this manner?
2 of the co-founders, Zachary Amata and Evan Gates, were really at the core of Housing Hawaiʻi's Future. And Zach was a recent college graduate a few years ago. Evan was a current college student, and he's going to graduate very soon. And what they recognized was if young people weren't civically engaged around the issue of housing, we were never going to solve the problem. And the reason was, if you looked back, we've had a housing crisis for decades, at least since World War II, but probably even before then. We've had a continual housing shortage in Hawaii, high housing prices, and all of the headlines you see today, you can go back to any decade and find the same headlines for decades. What hadn't ever happened was a concerted movement of younger people getting civically engaged and essentially taking on a revolutionary approach and saying, look, we've got to look at our fundamental assumptions and change things. And Zach and Evan had that idea for an organization that would do exactly that. And it's been a wild ride helping to co-found the organization and run the organization with them, because what I've realized is they were essentially correct. In the last 3 years, I believe we've made substantial progress, not nearly as much as I would have liked to, but you do see a difference being made. You see decision makers changing how they approach things. And there is a generational shift happening in our state right now in all kinds of leadership positions. In the state legislature, for example, the House Housing Chair and the Senate Housing Chair, Representative Luke Evslin and Senator Stanley Chang, are both millennials. And so they understand the struggle that is being faced by millennials, by Gen Z in the housing market, honestly, better than a baby boomer can, right? It's no offense. It's just, if you own a home, you don't understand what it's like to not own a home anymore. Your memories can't really help you to understand those challenges. And the situation that people face today with student debt, with the gulf between wages and home prices, is different now than it was in the past. So Zach and Evan and the co-founding crew really understood that if you could just get those people civically engaged, they would be the difference maker and the game changer for housing.
What does success look to you? What does it look like to you? I mean, you talked about progress. What did progress look like to you? And I'll be straight. Is this something that we can solve as community and have housing for our future so that they don't leave, so that they don't have to move to Oregon or even the Midwest where things are a little cheaper? What does success look like to you?
As a vision, I always say true sustainability means our children and grandchildren can afford to stay. And afford to stay doesn't mean have to stay, right? Obviously, there are incredible opportunities outside of Hawaii. And if people want to leave to pursue those, more power to them. The problem we have is people leave because they can't afford to stay. And that's the basic issue. As far as what that looks like in terms of concrete things, it means that housing prices should be more affordable than they are. Now, when I was here in the studio in April recording with Peter Savio and Tina Grandinetti and Luke Evslin, one of the things that came up was the idea of a locals-only housing market. And I think essentially this is the key to creating housing that locals can afford. We have a housing market right now that is an international housing market. Anyone can buy real estate here. There should be at least a portion of our real estate set aside for working families that are part of the community here and contributing with their work. We have an issue where our housing right now is allocated on the basis of income, which is well and good, but income is kind of blind to a lot of things that make families unique. For example, I live in a house of 6, right? So let's say my household income was $100,000, but I was the only person working. As far as income is concerned, that family is exactly the same as 6 people who are all working and combined earn $100,000. So the metrics, the measurements we use to give out housing are blind to important factors like, are people working in Hawaii? What kind of work are they doing? What I've advocated and what we've advocated at Housing Hawaii's Future is we should have workforce housing that's built for the workforce. So we should build housing and say, this housing is for people that work in this area, whether they're nurses, whether they're construction workers, teachers. If you work in this area, this housing is for you. Now, this workforce housing helps to address another issue, which is in Hawaii, we do have, as all places do, a kind of antipathy or even hostility toward foreigners. Correct. Or toward people who've recently arrived here. Now, my family, Japanese American, been here 4 or 5 generations, depending on which side you count. But a lot of families have recently arrived. On Maui, where I was living for the last few years, for decades, more than half the population have been foreign-born. Oahu just crossed that milestone a few years ago. Mm-hmm. So all across the state of Hawaii, it doesn't matter which island you're on, most of the people weren't born there. Mm-hmm. And that's fine, because it is not just people in Hawaii who are nurses or police officers or firefighters or small business owners. And so we have to be honest and realistic and say it's not just about making housing for people who've been here for generations, but we need to make sure that we have enough workforce housing for our nurses, for our healthcare professionals, for construction workers. And some of those people will not be from Hawaii, and that's okay. We need to make sure that that is provided for so that those people can have a future here.
I wonder, I'm not questioning you at all. I'm asking, what kind of incentive do you provide developers for to make this happen? And look at Kaka'ako, right? I mean, interestingly enough, you are now the recently named the chair of the Hawaii Community Development Authority. Congratulations, by the way. Talk about a huge responsibility. But Kaka'ako is like a main thrust of HCDA. And if you look at the buyers and the people around there, are developers looking at our local community enough? Is it concentrated? Do we have enough incentives for them to do so? What do you think about that?
I'll briefly touch on Kaka'ako and what I think went wrong.
Yeah.
So I grew up body surfing with my Uncle Claude at Point Panic, and I have an intimacy with Kaka'ako that most people will not have. I now live in Kaka'ako, and so I can look out my window and see Kaka'ako Makai, and it looks the same or worse than it did when I was a child. The recent addition of the increased medical facilities being an exemption, but everything else looks the same or worse than it used to 30 years ago. That means the idea of community development didn't work in Kaka'ako-Makai because the community didn't develop, it didn't substantially change. But on the Kaka'ako-Mauka side, and this is where the Howard Hughes development is, where the Kamehameha Schools development is, the state invested millions of dollars in infrastructure, hoping to support the development of high-rise housing, some market rate housing, some workforce housing, but housing that was intended for workers, for people from Hawaii. It didn't happen. And it didn't happen on the timeline that the people who planned it did for a couple of reasons. One was no one realized that large land trusts like the Ward Land Trust or the Kamehameha Schools Land Trust have no incentive to really develop housing. They're talking about billion-dollar portfolios. So they had land, and could they have made money by developing? Yes. But they didn't need to, and so they didn't. Then you have interest rates at certain times during that period. The interest rates were too high. And then you have Hawaii's development climate where it takes a long time. It adds to the cost of development. And so for a variety of reasons, not much got built until the last couple of decades. And I think a lot more development can occur in Kaka'ako. As far as what developers need to make that happen, there are three things I think are really important. So the first and most obvious is height and density. You just cannot, when land costs are really expensive, build affordable or workforce housing unless you're able to build high density housing, which means building up and it means building towards the lot lines, so more dense. And we give in the state of Hawaii exemptions to developers through a program called 201H that gives them height and density. And in Kaka'ako, we try to give as much height and density as we can. The second thing that developers need is regulatory certainty, because time is money. If you're borrowing $10 million or $50 million, every week, every month is interest on that loan. And so developers, in order to make anything work, have to know within the span of 3 to 5 years, I can start building and finish this project and get everything done. If it could be 5 years or it could be 20 years, nobody will build anything. And in Hawaii, a lot of times we don't get enough workforce housing development because of that uncertainty. So we have to create certain pathways with clear timelines for developers. And HCDA, I think, has done a good job in recent years of doing that. And the last thing is financing. So time is money, but the developers ultimately need money. Hawaii is a capital-constrained market. And that means we just don't have that much money here in Hawaii. At this point, the state is one of the largest funders of housing development. Now, some people celebrate that and they say that's good. I don't know that that's so good. What it means is that there isn't private capital here. So Hawaii has to be in the business of attracting foreign capital. Maybe it's Japanese capital, maybe it's American capital, and also creating capital vehicles here where we can deploy capital to develop housing. If you have those three things, you have height and density, you have a clear, certain development timeline, and you have capital, we could build a ton of housing, not just in Kaka'ako, but throughout the state. Where we're not building housing, it's typically for one of those three reasons. Either there's not enough density to make housing pencil out, there's timeline issues, regulatory uncertainty, which scares developers away or makes their projects unaffordable, or people just can't find the financing for their projects and they die.
There's a difference, though, between capital, when you talk about international or foreign capital, and then investors, right? Because what we saw in the 80s where investors came and gobbled up Kahala properties, or whether it be in downtown Honolulu or Kaka'ako, that in some people's eyes created this.
100%. And that's a good point, Ron. We can separate out productive from speculative investment, right? So a productive investment would be, I'm trying to start a donut shop. I go to the bank, I take out a $50,000 loan, and then I build out my donut shop, right? That's productive. A speculative investment would be somebody buying a beachfront mansion in Kahala with the idea that if they just sit on it for a few years, they could sell it for 50% more. I think that in the case of housing, a lot of people are upset about speculative investment. Unfortunately, because language is what it is, we just think foreign investment bad,
Right.
because we're worried about, Gensiro Kawamoto buying up Kahala Ave. In actuality, if Gensiro Kawamoto instead said, actually, I'm going to invest $500 million in building workforce housing, we should be celebrating that and say, awesome, right on. And there are Japanese investment companies, there are Japanese investors who could invest tens, hundreds of millions of dollars in housing. We do have to just sort of get over this hump of saying all investment is bad investment. Investment is great. Investment means that somebody with capital thinks that the place that you're living is going to grow and going to be better in the future than it is now. That's what an investor is looking for. And if we attract those people and say, hey, what you can invest in is building workforce housing for our nurses, our teachers, our firefighters, you'll be able to earn a return because housing is actually valuable, and you'll be creating a pro-social outcome. That's great. What people are upset about is investment that comes with antisocial outcomes. We don't want foreign investors buying all of the property in Hawaii and hiking rents up so high that local people can't afford it. But the idea that we can exist in a world without any foreign investment it's fanciful. It's silly.
Yeah.
It's just not.
It's fantasy.
It's fantasy.
It won't happen. Yeah. It's so interesting you talked about Mr. Kawamoto. Back when I was a young reporter, when he was literally gobbling up all the Kahala lots, one day my photographer and I, we saw him, and he was clearly looking to buy another one. So I took a stab at it, and I said, hey, stop the car. That's Kawamoto. And there was something about him that was just super intriguing, but there's a little arrogance about him as well. And he literally, Sterling, he literally opened his wallet for us and showed us this wad of money. And I was like, okay, this guy is at a whole different level of investing, if you will. But I can see why folks got really, angry at that. That is carried on. And unfortunately, the Mr. Kawamotos of this world did leave us with a taste in our mouth of foreign investment. But what you're saying is right. Without foreign investment, without international dollars, we cannot sustain, and we definitely cannot develop. So I go back to the question of how do you give them incentives? Is the return big enough, the ROI, on their investment? And how quickly can they sell? Because if you can have a property there that's, built, and then now all of a sudden, oh my gosh, we can't sell these units, when does it become problematic? And I think we've seen some of that, like you talked about in Kaka'ako.
Yeah, the thrust against foreign investment comes also from the fact that oftentimes people have not just invested, but they've bought ownership in hotels, for example. And so this concern about ownership being peeled away from local people is true. It's incredibly valid, right? A lot of the hotels are owned by foreigners. That means these, multinational hospitality corporations, we're a rounding error in their revenue. You have on Maui, right? The Mahi Pono is owned by a Canadian pension company ultimately. We're a rounding error in their real estate investment portfolio, right? So what for Maui is very important, tens of thousands of acres of prime agricultural land, is just a dollar amount in a spreadsheet somewhere in a Canadian pension company. And so fostering local ownership is important, but local ownership doesn't necessarily mean that all the capital comes from Hawaii. You could have a locally owned investment company that takes investors from international market, from the American market, and funnels that money into creating local ownership opportunities, and that would be great.
Ag land is obviously something that we want to protect as much as we can, but we've seen a switch and definitely a shift in some of that, whether it be on our neighbor islands here, definitely on Oahu. I just read about a hotel going up now in Ewa, which 20 years ago would be like, are you kidding me? But we've seen that it can happen and can work in Kapolei and other rural areas. Is that the future, though? I mean, is ag the answer to our land woes, if you will, for development?
It's controversial.
Yes, it is.
And I'll give you perspective. So 30 years ago, exactly, in 1994, Randy Roth was hosting a Price of Paradise radio show, and he was interviewing then director of planning. I think he still was director of planning, Harold Matsumoto. And Harold Matsumoto and the other guest on the program essentially outlined that a very small portion of Hawaii's land was zoned for urban uses. And if you only moderately increase the amount of agricultural land that was converted to urban uses, you could create substantial amounts of housing that would end the housing crisis. Interestingly enough, on Oahu, that was sort of proven true in a sense. And what I mean is, if you look at the Ewa Plain, or what we today called West Oahu, that was former agricultural land that was converted for urban uses and developed into housing. And for decades, the most affordable home ownership opportunities in the state of Hawaii, outside of maybe lots in Puna, have been there, right? It's been the gentry homes in Ewa Beach. It's been homes in Kapolei. And a lot of families on Oahu have started their home ownership journey in like a townhouse in Ewa Beach. And so typically when cities expand, it is the adjacent land outside that ends up getting converted into housing first. And that's the least expensive housing because there's nothing there. That's part of the solution, I think. And I'm not, before people misconstrue, I'm not saying convert all agricultural land into housing. That's not what these advocates have said. That's not what Harold Matsumoto was saying 30 years ago. All they were saying was, look at all the agricultural land you have and maybe figure out some of it is not that productive, will never be productive because of water access issues, what other issues there might be, and then think about converting some of that into housing. And that's part of the solution. That's one part. The other part is our already developed land making better use of it. So on Maui, for example, in the middle of Kahului is the Queen Ka'ahumanu Shopping Center. And even on Black Friday, the parking lot is 75% empty. This shopping center has been dying for decades and is on the brink of collapse. There have been various proposals over the year to redevelop it and build housing and a mixed-use mall in the urban core of Kahului that have floundered. It does look like now the current owners are moving in that direction, and hopefully they'll succeed. But throughout the state, there are malls, there are shopping strip malls that could be redeveloped into housing that have just kind of languished because there isn't a clear process for taking that land and building housing on it. And so land use is important, whether it's ag land or urban land. We just have to take an aerial view of the state of Hawaii and figure out, where are the jobs, where is the available land, and can we make sure that we're making the best use of it? And the best use of land might be agriculture in some cases, but in some cases, the best use of land is going to be building a 20-story workforce housing tower, and that's fine. We have to be honest, though, about the best use of land and making sure that we don't have, say, like a single-family home in the middle of an area that could be much more dense, which happens all the time, even in Kaka'ako.
Perfectly said. I've attended HCDA meetings, and some of them can be real snoozers. Some of them can be very intense. You talked a little bit about the infrastructure investment in Kaka'ako. Now that you are, the chair, you've led a couple of these meetings already. Your involvement, your generation's more vocal presence, if you will, is my hopes are high because I think that we needed that, right? I mean, some of our leaders and decision makers, let's face it, they're aging out and archaic thinking, and maybe even not afraid to pull the trigger on things. But what's your role now? What do you see your role, your purpose? I know you talked about purpose being a dad, but in that arena, you have a huge responsibility to move things forward.
It is a huge responsibility, and let's look at Kaka'ako Makai.
Yeah.
You have adjacent to the waterfront, adjacent to urban Honolulu, a large amount of land, much of which is undeveloped, some of which is car dealerships. Is this the best use of our prime waterfront land? I think a lot of people would say, no, it's not. Now, on the other hand, there are some people, and some of my friends from growing up at Point Panic body surfing that would say, don't build anything, don't change anything, don't mess with it. It's tough because you have two sides, right? So at least two sides. You have your environmental activists, your shoreline activists who say nothing can ever be built here, right? End of story, it's done. Then you have a group like the Office of Hawaiian Affairs who has a fairly large chunk of land right there that they would like to develop on. How do you adjudicate that conflict? I don't have an answer as the chair of HCDA. I do think that you should have a robust conversation. The problem with HCDA board meetings and government meetings in general is that the average person doesn't show up. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. One is the average person is working 70 hours a week and driving their kids to soccer practice, and they don't have time to show up. Understandable. Another is these meetings are not publicized and they don't meet at the right times. We're meeting in Wednesday mornings. People have work. People have jobs to do. And nobody's going to come down to Queen Street, and even the Zoom options, And then the last part is a lot of people feel kind of hopeless and cynical about politics in general. My take has always been if you adopt an attitude of cynicism, you guarantee the bad result that you fear. Because if you're cynical, then the only people that will show up will be cynical people. I myself try to maintain hope. So let me give you my hope for Kaka'ako My hope is 10 years from now, it will look different than it does today. Now, what does that look like? I don't know, because it's not my vision for Kaka'ako. It's trying to figure out, given the concerns of environmentalists and nearshore activists, given the desire of the Office of Hawaiian Affairs to develop some housing there, given some of the other landowners in the area, which include the city, the state, Kamehameha schools, are there ways that all of those interests can align to make a great use of this? And what is that use of it? And that's where an organization like the Hawaii Community Development Authority at its best has a robust community planning process that engages various stakeholders, that engages public testifiers to come up with a vision of what should be. Interestingly enough, that happened. There is a vision for Kaka'ako. It was developed decades ago, and nothing that's there is in the vision. Right. We didn't achieve the vision. And so it's not a guarantee that planning guarantees that you'll get what you want, but you do have to plan and at least have a vision for the future. To your point about age, and I think age is important in some cases, if you're not going to be there for years, you're not going to pull the trigger on thinking through a long-term planning process because it'll be somebody else's responsibility. I started serving on HCDA 2 years ago. I was the secretary, then the vice chair, and unexpectedly, the former chair, Chase Nishii, had to focus on some of the fallout from the insurance crisis and had to step away from the role. I didn't expect to be in this role as chair. I didn't, certainly maybe in the future, but not today. Now I do have to think, though, like, how do you bring people together to find a common vision? And that's not just a housing issue. That's an everything issue.
Absolutely.
Everything in Hawaii is about groups of people coming together and figuring out what do we want to see and how can we work together to achieve it. And in the seats that I'm in, I try to do my best at that. I'm not perfect, but I'm trying. And at Housing Hawaii's future, our hope is that more people would try to do that in whatever seats they find themselves in.
You know, I have so much high hopes for the future when it comes to our housing crunch, our housing crisis, actually. But what you talked about at Kaka'ako is kind of like a picture. It's like a perfect example of what can be, right? Because you have all of these different elements, different landowners, certainly the Rani Watanis of the world who are saving Kaka'ako and they don't want anything developed. The generation will still exist because the next person will come on. So if you can get somebody in the room and solve that, get everybody in the room and find common ground and purpose. And is it ambitious? Yeah. Is it doable? I think it is. You talked about cynicism. You know, so many people have tried. I want to say I wish you the best, but the reality is it's a real challenge. I mean, when you're talking about people who are really passionate about saving what little we have left, and you grew up in Point Panic, I body surfed there all my life. I totally feel you. And I felt I've covered many of those events as well. And I felt the passion. And at the same time, the reality is we need to move forward. How do you make folks come together and find that resolution? Is it in young voices? Is it in folks who will have this so that their children and their children's children can have a tomorrow?
Part of it is in young voices. And, there are things that don't happen in Hawaii because of a grudge someone has from 30 years ago. As I've gotten more involved in politics, I've realized a lot of politics plays out because of grudges and factions and things that happened before I was born. I think a lot of younger people think that that's silly. And maybe it's just because we haven't had the opportunity to form our own grudges yet, right? So maybe 30 years from now, I'll be, hating people and not wanting to talk to them because of something that happens today.
But you shouldn't have to own our mess.
Right. And that's where my approach is. I don't have grudges with anybody.
Right.
There are people I disagree with. It doesn't mean that I hate them. It doesn't mean that I won't talk with them. It doesn't mean that I put my head down and walk past them if I see them out on the street. We live on islands in the middle of the ocean. By some accounts, the most isolated islands in the whole world. We're going to have to work together to solve our problems. So it's not a matter of, do I want to work with stakeholders? That's the only way. It's not a matter of, am I willing to put aside what I want to figure out what we can all agree on? That's the only way. There's no dictator in Hawaii, even the governor. Everybody freaked out because of the governor's emergency proclamation on housing. There were lawsuits. And what happened? Well, he's not a dictator, so he wasn't able to just build housing everywhere with his emergency proclamation. In some ways, you'd almost prefer that there be a dictator who could get something done somewhere. But that's not the system we live in. The system we live in is one where if you want to get things done, you have to build coalitions, you have to form shared visions, and you have to really put one foot in front of the other for years, for decades. That's what all of those people did, including the Save Kaka'ako people. That didn't happen overnight, right? It was a lot of organizing, a lot of effort of people with a common vision. And historically, that's the only thing that ever makes a difference, right? Small groups of people with a shared vision who are willing to take step after step to achieve it.
Sterling Higa, you have, I've read about you. I mean, just looking at your resume, what you've accomplished, not just your education, but your nonprofit work, your work as a journalist with Civil Beat. I mean, you've worn many hats in your young life, and now dad and father. I think you're an inspiration for my generation, that we can look at the future and say, okay, you know what? There's hope. And I want to let you know that as a young boy who grew up seeing the conflicts and the crisis and the land fights and such, whether it be Kaho'olawe or Kaka'ako or Waianae, and I have hope for the future that we can get this done, and we can keep people here, and we can ekomamai those who are not from here, because that's the only way we're going to exist and thrive. And I wish you the best.
Thank you. And if I can, I'd be remiss to not mention some of the mentors I've had.
Absolutely.
We stand on the shoulders of giants, all those cliches, also true. I've been blessed. When I was in poetry, I had people like Liz Soto and Tui Scanlon and Travis Thompson and Darren Canberra pouring into me. When I was doing debate, I had my coaches Daniel Hugo, Cody Henserling, Jonathan Cham. In teaching at Hawaii Pacific University, I was hired by Dr. John Hart, who really helped mentor me, make me into a good teacher. And now with Housing Hawaii's Future, we have our wonderful board, but obviously we've had tons of mentors in the community who've been generous with their time, people like Colbert Matsumoto, Stanford Carr, Christine Camp. I couldn't understand even 1% of the things I understand if not for conversations with people who just poured in and answered questions. And what I would say to young people is, as much as we may feel like our elders don't care, they do. And actually, most people in Hawaii are willing to take time and answer questions, give advice, and pour into young people. And I think for young people, it's incumbent on us to take those opportunities. There are so many stories, histories, even the stories of grudges that we can get when we ask questions of our elders. And I wouldn't be in the position that I am today if not for all of the people who were really patient with me, really helpful. From Eric Paul Schaefer at Honolulu Community College onward, I've had so many people, my mom and my Uncle Claude among them, that helped make me who I am today. So, the resume is impressive, but the relationships are how the resume was created. Sterling is not like a resume, right? He's a son and a nephew, and then you get on to the husband and father thing, right? But before husband and father was a son and a nephew, and a student. So, thanks, Ron.
Today you're a young leader, inspiring many and making a difference. I call you a man with a purpose, but I just learned that you're much more than that, and that's very nice to know that we have young leaders out there like you that want to stay home, want to make a difference for the next generation to come. Wow, that was cool. Sterling Higa, good luck to you, and embrace every moment of fatherhood, parenthood, because they grow up fast.
Thank you, Ron.
Mahalo for joining us, folks. Join us next time, another episode of What School You Went. You never know who's going to drop by. Until then, ahui ho.
What School You Went is a PBS Hawaii production. Music by Taimane Gardner. If you enjoyed this episode, let us know on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and tell your friends. You can find us on pbshawaii.org and everywhere you get your podcasts.